Imagine New York in January 1966. The United States was a different place. Lyndon B. Johnson occupied the White House, and Simon and Garfunkel's The Sound of Silence topped the music charts, a title that would chillingly become literal within days. Back then, you didn't carry a weather map in your pocket. You relied on a morning newspaper, a transistor radio on your kitchen counter, and the sight of a gray sky. It was a Saturday night, and residents across the Northeast were settling in for late-night television. As people prepared for bed, the snow looked unremarkable, just a light dusting easily overlooked. Yet, while the region slept, the world outside was gradually being obscured. By Sunday morning, the familiar sounds of urban streets and rural roads had vanished. By Monday, entire neighborhoods seemed erased. Roads disappeared and landmarks vanished. In some areas, it was impossible to tell where a street had once been, buried under an enveloping stillness. This was the blizzard of 1966, the storm that abruptly froze the Northeast. This wasn't a singular storm experience. Rather, it comprised dozens, each unfolding uniquely, block by block, town by town. What was manageable in one neighborhood became catastrophic just a few miles away. The blizzard did not affect everyone equally, and this disparity was profoundly unsettling. Saturday, January 29th, 1966. The evening unfolded like any other winter weekend across New York State and its surrounding areas. Families gathered for dinner, teenagers chattered on landline telephones with cords stretching through hallways. Fathers relaxed in armchairs with newspapers, while mothers finished washing dishes. Radiators clanged and hissed, battling the January chill. Outside, the temperature hovered around 12 degrees Fahrenheit. It was cold, certainly, but cold was expected in the Northeast during winter. The forecast mentioned snow, as it often did. Late January snow was as predictable as morning traffic. The weatherman on the evening news spoke of accumulation, a few inches, perhaps more by morning. Nothing that would halt daily life. People heard this forecast and gave it no further thought. They had witnessed snow before, plenty of it, so what difference would a few more inches make? Thus, they went to bed, pulling up their blankets, making plans for Sunday. Church, brunch, maybe a walk if the weather cleared. They were oblivious to what was already brewing in the darkness above them. Most people don't realize that in 1966, weather forecasting lacked satellite technology. Over the Atlantic, a colossal nor'easter was intensifying with unforeseen speed. Cold air rushing down from Canada was on a collision course with moisture-laden air pushing up from the coast. In the ensuing days, areas near Lake Ontario would be repeatedly pummeled as lake-effect snowbands added to what had already fallen. Around midnight, the snowfall intensified. Most people were asleep and didn't notice. The flakes were thick and heavy, clinging to everything they touched. They accumulated on windowsills and covered parked cars, beginning to obliterate the familiar outlines of the world outside. By 2 a.m., visibility rapidly deteriorated across much of the region. The few vehicles still on the roads found their headlights useless against the opaque whiteness ahead. Drivers pulled over, some attempting to wait it out, others abandoning their cars on the spot. By 4 a.m., the wind arrived. This was no gentle breeze or typical winter gusts that Northeasterners casually dismissed. This was different. The wind shrieked across open farmland at speeds that transformed the snow into a horizontal barrage. In exposed areas, gusts powerful enough to knock people off their feet drove the snow sideways, making it feel less like weather and more like a weapon. The snow was no longer just falling. It was attacking. January 30th, 1966. Arthur, a 52-year-old transit worker, resided in a third-floor walk-up on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Having commuted by subway for 23 years, he knew the system better than most people knew their own homes. When his alarm sounded at 6 a.m., he followed his usual routine. He swung his legs out of bed, shuffled to the window to check the weather, and then froze. The window was white, solid white. He couldn't see anything, not the street, not the buildings across the way, not even the fire escape 3 feet from his window. He suspected something was wrong with his eyes. He rubbed them, looked again, and still, it was white. Then he realized the white was moving, swirling. The window wasn't blocked. The world outside simply ceased to exist. There was only snow and wind, an emptiness where his familiar street used to be. Arthur would later recount to his grandchildren that in that moment, standing at his window in his undershirt and pajama pants, he felt genuine fear for the first time since the war. Across the region, countless variations of this scene unfolded. A mother in Brooklyn tried to open her front door, only to find it stubbornly stuck. Snow had drifted against it, compacting into a solid mass. She pushed harder, to no avail. She called for her husband. Together, they threw their weight against it. The door cracked open, revealing nothing but white through the gap. They would not leave their house for 2 days. A doctor in Queens awoke to his telephone ringing. The hospital needed him. There was an emergency. He promised to be there as quickly as possible. He hung up and walked to his front window. His car was gone. Not stolen, but buried. A white mound sat where his Buick had been, only the radio antenna protruding through the snow like a desperate plea. He began digging. 2 hours later, he had barely reached the door handle. The hospital would have to wait. Everyone would have to wait. An 11-year-old child in the Bronx awoke to silence. That's what she recalled most vividly decades later. Not the snow, but the silence. The city that supposedly never slept was utterly and completely quiet. She initially thought she had gone deaf. Then she heard the wind, a low moan that seemed to emanate from all directions simultaneously. The true intensity of this storm, however, was not in the city, but upstate. In Syracuse, the figures were staggering. Over 40 inches of snow fell in just a few days. But that number alone doesn't convey the full story. The wind sculpted this snow into drifts that defied belief. 15 feet high in some places, 20 feet in others, higher than houses, higher than first-floor windows. People looking out of their second-story bedrooms saw nothing but white walls pressed against the glass. In Oswego, a city on the shore of Lake Ontario, the totals were almost incomprehensible. The official measurement approached 100 inches, more than 8 feet of snow, but the drifts rendered measurements nearly meaningless. What do you call it when the snow is taller than the buildings? A man from Oswego, interviewed years later, described stepping out of his bedroom window onto the snow. Not jumping into it, but walking onto it. The drifts were so densely packed, so solidified by the wind, that he could stand on them without sinking. He traversed his neighborhood on a white highway that undulated over buried cars, fences, and everything else. The town completely shut down. Nothing moved except snowmobiles, and even they struggled. Some bars miraculously managed to open, and for a few days the community gathered wherever they could find warmth and company. It was like a party, one survivor recalled, but beneath the laughter, everyone knew how serious it was. Here's what truly needs to be understood about this storm. The snow was only one component. The wind made it lethal. Sustained winds that didn't relent for days, gusts that transformed the snow into a horizontal assault, sandblasting exposed skin and making vision impossible. You couldn't walk into that wind. You couldn't even stand in it. The wind knocked people down. It picked up snow and drove it through the tiniest cracks in doors and windows. People awoke to find snow inside their homes, piled in hallways, blown in through gaps they never knew existed. And the cold. Temperatures plunged into the single digits. With the wind, the effective temperature was brutal, freezing exposed flesh in minutes. This was a storm that claimed lives. And indeed it did. Across the region, the death toll escalated. Heart attacks from shoveling, car accidents on invisible roads, people who became lost in the whiteout and froze within sight of their own homes. Yet most survived by doing the only thing possible. They stayed indoors. They waited. They prayed for it to end. By noon on Sunday, the magnitude of the disaster became evident across the entire Northeast. Major airports across the region closed. Not just delayed, but shut down. Runways had disappeared under drifts reaching the windows of parked aircraft. Thousands of travelers found themselves stranded in terminals never designed as hotels. Trains stopped. The Long Island Railroad, the New Haven Line, and routes across upstate New York all ground to a halt. Switches froze solid. Tracks vanished. Engineers couldn't discern signals through the whiteout conditions. Buses stopped. In many communities, transit systems that prided themselves on continuous operation admitted defeat. There was simply no way to navigate a bus through streets that no longer existed. In New York City, the subway continued to run in many areas. Underground lines were shielded from the worst of the storm. But above ground, where elevated trains operated exposed to the elements, service became impossible. And reaching a subway station meant somehow navigating streets that had transformed into impassable white canyons. Across the region, the economic damage was immense. Businesses couldn't open. Workers couldn't reach their jobs. Factories stood idle. Ports that usually bustled with activity fell silent. While some estimates peg the overall expenses in the hundreds of millions of dollars, this figure fails to capture the human suffering. The lost wages, the unpaid bills, and the small businesses that never fully recovered. Most people believed the worst was over when Monday morning arrived. But they were mistaken. Although the snow had largely ceased in many areas, the wind persisted in exposed locales, and the region was so profoundly buried that excavation would require not mere hours or days, but weeks. The equipment that had successfully managed every storm the region had encountered for decades proved inadequate. Plows would clear a road only for the wind to refill it before they reached the next block. When they pushed snow to the side, it created walls so high that a subsequent pass became impossible. They often became trapped in drifts that completely engulfed them. In Syracuse, Salina Street, a major thoroughfare, had snowdrifts exceeding 20 feet. The only way to clear it was to manually lift the snow and transport it away in dump trucks because there was no alternative place to push it. It simply had to be relocated. Helicopters delivered provisions to isolated communities. Bulldozers, not just snowplows, but actual bulldozers, were brought in to create pathways for emergency personnel, making the scene resemble a war zone. Schools remained closed for a week in many districts, some even longer. It took 4 or 5 days for most major streets in the hardest-hit communities to become passable. However, amidst this chaos, an extraordinary response emerged. When official systems faltered, communities appealed for assistance, and help arrived, not from the government, but from each other. Across the region, fathers and sons, armed with shovels, ventured out, not to clear their own driveways, but to clear those of their neighbors, to check on the elderly couple down the street, and to ensure the widowed woman with a bad hip had food and warmth. They organized themselves spontaneously, without prompting, central coordination, social media, or any of the communication tools we now take for granted. They simply perceived what needed to be done and acted. In one Brooklyn neighborhood, a group of teenage boys dedicated 2 days to excavating their entire block. They sought no payment or recognition, simply showing up with shovels and commencing their labor. A baker in Queens miraculously managed to open his shop. To this day, the specifics of how he arrived, ignited his ovens, and acquired flour, yeast, and other necessary supplies remain a mystery. Nevertheless, he baked bread and distributed it to anyone in need. For 3 days, his bakery became the heart of his neighborhood, a warm haven, a source of sustenance, and a testament that the community had not completely succumbed. Children witnessed their fathers transform into explorers, setting off into a white wilderness with empty sleds and returning hours later, exhausted and frostbitten, with grocery bags secured by rope. Those children never forgot that image. For children, the blizzard was an entirely different experience. School was canceled, not merely for a day, but for a whole week in many areas. Imagine, a week without school. A week of liberation. A week with snow so deep you could construct anything. The snowdrifts, far from being impediments, became playgrounds for children. Kids burrowed into snowbanks, fashioning intricate cave systems, hollowing out rooms, adding windows, and building entire subterranean kingdoms beneath the white surface. The wind had so compressed the snow that it maintained its form, allowing it to be sculpted like clay. They even sledded directly off roofs, literally, because in many locations the snow had drifted so high against houses that the roof offered a gentle incline, leading down to a white expanse where the front yard once lay. A girl from the Syracuse area, who was 7 during the blizzard, recounted decades later that she simply exited her second-story window and slid down the drift to where her friends awaited. They spent the whole day constructing snowmen so tall they required ladders to complete the heads. A boy from Rochester, above all, remembered the silence. He had grown up accustomed to the ceaseless sounds of traffic, buses, and a bustling community. Then, abruptly, there was nothing but the muffled quiet of a world enveloped in white. He could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear his mother calling from 3 houses away. Sound traveled differently when everything was still. The blizzard bestowed upon children something precious, an adventure, a story they would narrate for the rest of their lives. A week when daily routines were suspended and they were free to explore a transformed world. However, for adults, the experience was markedly different. The blizzard starkly revealed the fragility of existence, how swiftly the systems they relied upon could crumble, and the precarious balance between normal life and survival. Parents observed their children playing, yet a quiet dread festered beneath their joy. They meticulously counted the cans in the pantry, rationed milk, and pondered their plight if the plows failed to arrive tomorrow, or the day after, or ever. Many of them felt genuinely trapped for the first time. Then came the daunting cleanup. What do you do with such an immense volume of snow? You couldn't merely push it aside. There was nowhere to displace it. Streets were too narrow, empty lots already filled. So they picked it up, literally. Work crews manually loaded snow into dump trucks, shovel by shovel, truck by truck. They transported it to vacant lots, parking areas, or any available space. The cleanup consumed weeks, and in some regions, months. The final vestiges of snow from the 1966 blizzard did not melt until May in shaded corners and deep valleys. By then, it had transformed into something else, a monument, a testament, a stark reminder of the events during those impossible days of late January. Many who experienced both the 1966 and 1993 blizzards were later asked which was worse. The answer was almost invariably the same. Once you've lived through 66, everything else is just weather. The storm instigated changes, not just to streets and infrastructure, but also to people's perception of winter, preparedness, and the essential requirements for community survival. Following 1966, cities across the region invested in snow removal equipment, more plows, additional salt, more sand, and enhanced interagency coordination. Communities that had been caught off guard vowed never to be unprepared again. Weather forecasting also improved, though not as a direct consequence of the blizzard. Satellites began providing images of storms from space, and radar technology advanced. The tools that might have predicted the blizzard's intensity were under development even as people excavated their front steps. By the time the next generation confronted their own storms, they would have warnings, hours of advance notice, time to prepare, time to stock up, time to remain at home. The inhabitants of 1966 had none of these advantages. They faced the blizzard relying solely on their resilience and the aid of their neighbors, and they prevailed. However, the true legacy of the blizzard resided not in policy shifts or equipment acquisitions, but in the enduring memories. Everyone who experienced it remembered. They recalled the silence, the biting cold, and gazing out their windows at a world entirely composed of white. They remembered the neighbor who appeared with a shovel without being asked, the baker who freely distributed bread, the teenage boys who excavated an entire block without compensation, and the fathers who pulled sleds through waist-deep snow to bring food home to their loved ones. They remembered the feeling of being genuinely stranded, and crucially, they remembered the sensation of being truly assisted. Ask anyone who was there, and they'll describe it as the worst storm they ever witnessed. And in the same breath, they'll speak of the kindness of strangers, the community that coalesced when everything else disintegrated, and the way people cared for one another. This is the nature of disasters. They strip away the superficial, revealing what lies beneath. And in January 1966, beneath the tough exterior of the Northeast lay something beautiful. Neighbors who were previously unacquainted learned each other's names during the blizzard. Strangers forged friendships. Communities that prided themselves on independence discovered they were stronger when they relied on one another. That memory has since faded. Most of the people who endured the blizzard are now in their 70s and 80s, and some have passed away. Their children recall the narratives. Their grandchildren have heard them secondhand. Yet the story holds significance. It matters because it reminds us of our capabilities, our capacity for endurance, and our potential for generosity. It matters because someday another storm will arrive. Perhaps not snow, but something else entirely that will test us, strip away the ordinary, and compel us to discover our true selves. When that day comes, we will need to remember the blizzard of 1966, not for its snow depths, wind speeds, or damage estimates, but for the fathers with sleds, the bakers with bread, and the neighbors with shovels. We will need to remember that when all else failed, people did not. Somewhere in upstate New York, in a neighborhood transformed beyond recognition since 1966, an old man still contemplates that storm. He was only 11 then, just a child, but he vividly recalls his father waking him before dawn on Monday morning. His father handed him a shovel, not a child's toy, but a real one, heavy and wooden-handled. Together, they stepped outside into a world utterly transformed overnight. The boy was astonished by what he saw. His street was gone. The cars were gone. Everything familiar had vanished beneath a seemingly endless white blanket. His father began to dig, so he too began to dig. They labored for hours, clearing their own walkway, then proceeding to clear the elderly woman's walkway next door. They pressed on, joined by other neighbors he barely knew, a collective of men and boys, all tackling the formidable white mountain, one shovel at a time. By day's end, his arms throbbed, his back screamed in protest, and his fingers, despite his mittens, were numb. Yet, he had never felt such vitality, such a profound connection to his father, his neighbors, and his community. He is an old man now, having weathered numerous winters since. Still, when snow begins to fall, the wind intensifies, and forecasts predict heavy accumulation, his mind drifts to that Monday morning, to his father handing him a shovel, to learning at the age of 11 what it felt like to be part of something greater than himself. That is the true narrative of the 1966 blizzard. It wasn't merely about the snow or the cold. It was about the world falling silent, and the people, those who appeared, those who assisted, those who refused to let the storm have the final say. They are the reason New York endured, the reason Syracuse survived, the reason Oswego, Rochester, and every buried town and frozen neighborhood pulled through. Because when the world transforms into white, roads vanish, and conventional rules no longer apply. We still have each other. The blizzard of 1966 receded into history. The snow thawed, streets reappeared, and life resumed its usual rhythm. People returned to work, to school, and to the daily routines that had been suspended during those improbable days. Yet, something lingered. For years afterward, whenever snow was forecast, people across the Northeast eyed the sky differently. They remembered, stocking up a little earlier, checking on their neighbors a little sooner. They no longer took the ordinary for granted quite as much. And when they gathered for family dinners or holiday parties, and the conversation turned to weather and winter, someone invariably brought it up, sharing the universal truth. We made it through together. That is the legacy of the blizzard of 1966. Not just a record snowfall, not merely a historical weather event, but a story, a shared memory, a testament to what ordinary people can achieve in extraordinary circumstances. The snow of 1966 melted long ago. Those who lived through it are aging. Some have passed on. Yet the story persists. And as long as we continue to tell it, it always will. If you recall the blizzard of 1966, please like this video and share your story in the comments. If you wish to support this channel and help us continue to bring these tales from American history's best moments, consider becoming a member or giving a super thanks. Every like and comment genuinely means a great deal. We are truly grateful for your understanding.